This video looks at some of the interesting things that happened in everyone's mind, including yours. Briefly, it's about thinking about what you're thinking about. In 4 chapters, we're going to look at the behaviour, the psychology, and some of the suggested underlying science about thinking. We'll then wrap it all together in a few thoughts, if you'll excuse the pun, that should leave you slightly wiser, but probably thinking more about what you think than you did before. Now, you're probably wondering why I just showed you an elephant. Was it about that elephants actually have excellent memories? Is it about animal consciousness and they're a higher being? You know, perhaps they have some social behaviour and order and they work in groups in a hierarchy? Or is it simply talking about the elephant in the room? In fact, probably in just a fraction of a second, your brain come up with all sorts of ideas, probably unrelated to those. So do write them down in the comments below. I'm curious as to what you actually thought about when you saw the elephant. But despite that, it is rather interesting thinking about why you came up with those thoughts. Did you command your brain to generate all those ideas about elephants? No? Did they just arrive and suddenly, poof, there's ideas about elephants, all sorts of ideas. Elephants doing this, pink elephants, elephants when you're drunk, all sorts of things. Is that what happened? Elephants squeezed into mini minor cars. Where did those ideas come from? We tend to feel that the conscious me part creates our thoughts, but you didn't ask it to. So which part of your brain ordered those thoughts to be created? Now, some of you might know more about, the mind and things and say it's the unconscious mind, or, but you didn't ask it to do anything. And some of you might actually know, it's the subconscious as it's called today, but, unconscious mind was back in the Freud days. Same thing. It's the bit that does the thinking that you don't actually know is going on until something suddenly appears in your head. So, but that's a bit of a label. Really, saying it's from your subconscious. It's like, I don't know. There's something in the background there that's controlling things. What's going on? How did it get there? Let's talk about that. So if you were thinking about those elephant thoughts, if you just focus on those for a moment, could you describe them all as soon as you saw the picture? Like the instant you saw the picture, would you have all these thoughts ready to go and you know exactly what they are and you could just speak them out as fast as you possibly could or write it down as fast as you possibly could because you know exactly what they are? Or is it the fact that you know you've got a bunch of thoughts but you don't know exactly what they are, but as soon as you start speaking, there they are. There's this thought, then another thought, then another thought, and another thought. You don't know what they are until you actually say them out loud. Now, some people will argue that's about extroverts and introverts. Introverts all know exactly what they're going to say before they say it. Extroverts don't. That's a generalization, but it's pretty accurate. But it's almost like the ideas were actually lined up somewhere, being generated, ready to be spoken or be focused on by your actual conscious mind. Your self-awareness would focus down on each of those individual ideas. And they're just sort of waiting in the wings or under the covers, or they're, in a box somewhere, or they're in the basement and you've got to open the flap up and let them out. So let's move on and dig a little bit deeper into these ideas. So chapter 1 is your brain starts thinking before you do. Bear with me on this. I know that sounds strange. Think of a film, any film. You probably, thought of one immediately, but did you consciously work through a catalogue of every single film that you've ever watched? No. Something just presented a film name to you. It just popped into your head from somewhere. Now, the same thing happens also when you have a forgotten name that suddenly returns to you at an inappropriate time and you suddenly just remember it or blurt it out. It's like, his name was Williams, that's his name, and you just forgot, but something in the back of your head's been working on it. Or what happens if something gets thrown at you and just out of the corner of your eye you see it and you suddenly duck? You didn't ask yourself to duck, it just happened. So who's controlling that? And you wake up with an answer to a problem you had at work yesterday, or some puzzle that you had, and or it's in a game, and there's some particular side quest that you suddenly wake up and it's like, there's the answer. Or you're in some situation, maybe it's a work situation with friends, something else, and you just have this feeling, there's something wrong. And later on you work out what it is. But which part of you knew that there was something wrong but didn't tell you about it? So from the psychology point of view, we experience this completed thought. It arrives as a ready-made package and you can unfold it and there's all the words, there's the thought, there's the images, it's all there. And we don't actually experience the process that went into putting that thought together, assembling, the searching for, the constructing that thought. It just appears as a ready-made package. And this gives us that the conscious brain, where you're aware of what's going on, is doing all the work. But your conscious awareness is actually only receiving the top level of ideas that have been processed elsewhere. And there's a scientific experiment that proves that. There was a cunning psychological experimentalist, Benjamin Libet, in about 1983. He did this experiment where he asked people to do a simple movement whenever they chose, and it was something to do with moving their wrist or something like that, and report it to the people observing then. As soon as they became aware that they were deciding, I'm about to move my wrist, here we go, you'd hold it, you wouldn't do anything, you'd wait, then suddenly, oh, move my wrist. So you have to tell them before you're going to move it. So you just wait. Now, and then you move. Okay, so it's like, okay, so you're making the decision there. Your conscious brain is making the decision. They stuck electrodes onto the people's brain to track what they're, not the details of their thinking. I mean, you're putting electrodes on the outside and you've got 80 billion neurons in there. You're not going to be tracking individual neurons, but you get a general picture of, is the brain active, is it not active, and they can sort of hone it down to a few regions in your brain. So this is what the experiment was about, and they were looking for peaks or spikes in the data as you were making these decisions. And guess what? The really interesting thing is it clearly showed a sharp spike in activity 300 milliseconds, that's about a third of a second, before the person said they were about to do something. Now, this is often described as the brain deciding before the person does, which is very confusing because isn't the person and the brain the same thing? So researchers still disagree about exactly what's going on there and what this early activity represents, but nobody argues with the fact it actually happens. This experiment's been reproduced many times. It really truly happens. You say, I'm now doing something or about to do something, but your brain spikes before you say that. So it's like before you know you're going to say it, something in your brain activates. And 300 milliseconds, a third of a second, that's quite a long time. Things could happen in your head quite a bit before that. So what is going on there? So obviously what is going on is there's some parts of your brain below your awareness level, let's call it in your subconscious, are working, and they're thinking, oh, I have to come up with say the word now. When will I do that? When will I do that? Those processes going on at a lower level in your brain that you're not aware of, they suddenly decide, oh yeah, now. And it takes a while for that signal to get to your conscious brain and then for you to say the word now. Now, normally when between deciding on something and speaking, they've measured that. That's a really short time frame. Your brain controls your mouth and when you speak very quickly. Otherwise, we couldn't speak fast. So there's something that's going on at a lower level, some kind of an awareness. It knows what's going on in the outside world, but you're not actually consciously aware of what it's doing. It can do things like recognize patterns, produce probabilities of what's going on in the future, and plan to make responses. So this conscious awareness seems to be updated later as to what's going on under the hood. So if conscious awareness is only happening in the visible foreground, what happens when that foreground consciousness disappears altogether? What are you left with? Chapter 2, you disappear and then you come back again. So the behaviour we're looking at here is under a general anaesthetic. It seems like you disappear for an hour or two. One moment you're there, you're talking, you're feeling, you're thinking things in the operating theatre. The next minute you're waking up in recovery. If you've never had the experience, that's exactly how it happens. It is not like sleeping. When you sleep and you wake up, you're kind of aware that some time has passed and things like that. And also you can be woken up if you're sleeping. But if you've ever experienced actual anaesthesia, it really is quite weird. There is just this utter and complete break. 1 second you're in one place, the next second you're in a different place, a different atmosphere. Quite a few people are very confused when they first wake up. They don't remember being confused. My wife's an operating theatre nurse, seen it all the time. People wake up, they don't know where they are, they might not even remember their name, they might not know anything. 10 seconds later, they're fine, maybe 20 seconds. Some people panic because they don't know what's going on, who they are, whatever. Suddenly they're good. And then they're fine, and their brain sort of picks up, their consciousness comes back. So what's going on? There's this gap, it's almost like there's no darkness, there's no waiting, there's nothing. And then you're back again. A little bit of confusion, and then you're back. So what's actually happened to your thinking part of your brain then? In fact, if you think about it, the surprising part, and thankfully it is true, that the person who returns after anaesthesia is exactly the same person. You've got the same memories, the same personality, you have the same weird sense of humour, and whatever makes you you survives that interruption, although your conscious experience as self had disappeared. So, what's the science behind that? Now, we've got to think about this a little bit deeper because whilst your awareness has stopped, not everything in your brain has just been switched off. There's different kinds of processing that continues. But the organised brain signals, which ordinary consciousness needs to be self aware, that becomes really severely disrupted. And as the drugs wear off, that larger organisation and self awareness comes back. Now, this doesn't prove that consciousness is stored in one particular place, but it suggests that the enduring architecture, like the physical neurons and all the connections and synapses that are inside your brain, that they preserve certain patterns and things that help to recreate the person that you are and the memories and your experiences and things. So your memories and learned responses, habits, and your disposition, your personality, those all remain behind, even though a lot of the connections have been disrupted for that period whilst you're under anaesthetics. So when the wider system becomes active again, yourself is sort of reconstructed and rebuilt based on all those connections and the synapses and the chemical signals to an extent. So not everything that persists in your brain, though, is actually useful. And that's what we'll look at next. Chapter 3, Emotional Triggers, the Ghost in the Patterns. Now, imagine this. You recall when someone used a certain tone of voice and you immediately become defensive, or you have a particular smell that you smell and it takes you back decades to a particular location when you were a child. Maybe it's a musty smell and it reminds you of being in the attic or something like that, or going into an old house. Or somebody makes a harmless remark at work or when you're out with friends and you react really strongly, much more strongly than is needed in the situation, almost surprising you and the other people around you who know you. And then after that reaction, you sort of explain to yourself why the reaction, it was completely reasonable and fine, but you're left scratching your head. What is going on there? Why did I respond that way? Why did I say that to that person? It's that's the behaviour. Now, let's look. What's going on behind that? Now, obviously, sometimes your explanation is right. It was just a random thing. But sometimes it's your conscious mind covering up for a response that began somewhere else, somewhere long ago and in the past probably. In counselling, people often know exactly what it is they feel, but they have surprisingly little idea about what the feelings were that they arrived at that point so quickly. It's like, what led up to that? How did I actually get to feeling, really annoyed with that person or really fearful of something else? What's actually driving that? So a current situation that you're in may resemble an older experience that you've had in only one small respect, but that resemblance can be enough to activate that old emotional pattern. So the science tells us that your emotional memories are not stored in one particular neat location. There's several factors that are involved. There's the actual emotion, and was it fear, was it surprise, was it revulsion, was it's a strong emotion, or grief perhaps, and that will have a certain intensity. So another factor involved is the context. Where did you experience that emotion? What happened at the time? What was the time of day? Who were you with? What were you doing? That's a sensory detail. There might be images associated with when that happened, or there might be a particular smell associated with that. There's a body response that you might have had at that original experience, like a pain, or there might have been rapid breathing, rapid heartbeat. And then later on after that, you interpret what's going on and you think about it. So there's thoughts about that. So a similar cue, much later in the future, can activate that response before conscious mind has a chance to reflect on what has actually happened there. What has it identified in the background of your mind? What has it identified that is the same as another situation? You might hear a screech of tyres and you're in a car accident as a kid or earlier on a traumatic accident. So you hear a screech of tyres again without knowing it. You suddenly break out in a sweat, your heart goes fast, or it's a fight or flight sort of reflex about survival. You've got no control over that. That just happens. To our human brain, these are all really important feelings relating to survival most often. Maybe you heard a loud roar and you felt extreme fear, so you ran. Your heart's thumping, your breathing's racing, or maybe you heard a breaking of dinner plates and there was the fear when your father fell to the floor after that, and the grief at his death. Or maybe it was an angry argument with shouts and violence, and you felt fear for your safety, and quite rightly at the time, maybe if you're a small child. But it just repeats if somebody else yells aloud, in a work situation, for instance, or you're in a sporting game and people are yelling, even just watching movies. So these past experiences don't need to be completely understood or have a complete match with the present. They only need to be detected enough with a similarity to what's happening in the current to produce that urgent warning and response. So your conscious awareness may receive the emotion after the response has happened and tries to process it on what's going on, but you probably don't have control of that first wave at all, and you still have control over what you might do next. But for some people, they're constantly re-triggered by these powerful experiences, but in the present, even when they're safe and far away from any danger, and that response is no longer useful in any way, but it still stops you from getting on with your normal life. So that's another example of something thinking going on in the background that you're not really in control of. But shake yourself off for a minute. Let's take a deep breath from that one, because we've got some more exploring to do. But thought has existed then long before humans even had language. That's our next thought. Chapter 4, the cat problem. What are thoughts made of? Now, imagine this situation. Your cat remembers places, they anticipate feeding times, they recognise people, they recognise routines, they solve simple problems. They appear to be dreaming. A cat can stare at an empty food bowl with such intensity that you feel that you are committed a moral offence if you haven't fed them yet. And then they are likely just to sniff it and eat it and wander off. So, what is actually going on here? The cat is probably not thinking, he's neglecting his responsibilities and I intend to register a formal complaint. That's not what's going on. And it does not need a human-style internal monologue to remember, expect, fear, desire or plan. After all, cats have been around for a long time without people talking to them or anything like that, and we know they don't have language. So what is its internal experiences when the cat is going through these scenarios? Okay, humans with feeding them from a bowl doesn't exist if humans are not around, but they clearly don't have a language and they're not great at understanding words, or they pretend they're not. So, but if your cat sees, a bird when it's looking out the window, it jumps onto the windowsill, it makes its little chattering noises with its mouth, and we know that it's thinking in its head that I'd love to go outside and catch that bird. It's probably not thinking about actually eating it or feeling about the bird struggling to get away, but there's the beginning of a thought there, and certainly for a survival situation, that's all the cat needs to do. It needs to chase after the bird and catch it. And perhaps there might be sensory images, it might have some spatial maps about running along, jumping on the fence and going down behind the bush to get closer. It might have an emotional state, a body urges, and the cat starts trembling sometimes. Dogs certainly do. If you hold a dog back from, you throw a bowl and you hold the dog back, you say, wait, the dog is trembling with excitement and anticipation. But what are they thinking, So the suggested science behind this is that animals clearly have some meaningful kind of thinking that's going on inside their heads without human language. So that means that language cannot be the foundation of all thoughts. So it probably expands thought enormously so that you can put labels onto things and manipulate ideas with symbols and then words which become those symbols. We can rehearse an argument perhaps, or we can organise our memories, or we can share complex ideas with other people. But it might sit really on top of older forms of thought, pre-language type of thinking, rather than actually creating a thought out of nothing. So beneath the language, our own minds might still operate largely through simple patterns, through feelings, expectations, and remembered situations often related to survival. So words might be a commentary, but not the entire game. A label applied after the fact. So in closing, we've got to ask this question. We've talked about feelings and thinking below the conscious level, below the awareness level. They can even take over your thinking when something comes up unexpectedly, like our elephant earlier on. some part of your brain is working on that. Which part? We're not in control. What's going on? Who's in charge? So in conclusion, we're going to look at who is actually doing the thinking. We've looked at these 4 strange features of the mind where decisions start, scientifically proven, before you know they've started, how your consciousness can disappear and come back later, how emotional reactions can happen before you can even control it and they just take over. And then there's the fact that meaningful thought might not actually be based on language. In fact, if you think about it hard, it's not based on language. You can have thoughts and feelings and things that you can't even put into words. So clearly it's not based on that. So none of these observations and things, if you look at them together, none of them solve consciousness and tell you what it is. But they are pieces of a puzzle that you can put into place in different locations that help to build up a picture of what your consciousness is and your self-awareness. So together they suggest that the consciousness is part of the mind, and it's only a small part of the whole operation, that there's other things going on in there that we are not aware of. It might be related to recognizing things, to remembering things, to anticipate what might be about to happen, worrying about things, just going round and around in circles in the background, testing new possibilities, and preparing our behavior for what comes next. So in some ways, in some of these situations, you can see that your conscious awareness only receives the results when they become important enough to surface up to the point where you become aware of those. Important things might be going on in the background, or unimportant things, and you're just not aware of that. How many things are you thinking of right now? Can you count them? How many things are you thinking of? It might be 5, might even be 8 things if you've got a lot on your mind. But look, in any particular instant, the human mind only thinks of a handful of things at any one time, completely different things. And if you stop and you think, okay, I've got to think about some essay I've got to write or some shopping I have to do for tea, then you can dig down into that and get more details. But the high level thought, there's only a handful of those at any one time inside your head. But you know that there's all sorts of things going on in the background. You're thinking about, when I do the washing, that work I've got to do next week. You've got to polish the car on the weekend. You've got to pick up the kids and do something. All sorts of stuff. There's a huge list you could come up with that's in the background somewhere. They're not in your current thoughts, not in your current list of, remember a list of numbers, and you can remember like 5 or 8 or 10 numbers if you're lucky. But not in that list. There's another list. There's a whole bunch of stuff going on in the background. So what's going on there? Because it's not the forefront of your thinking. So your whole consciousness is all of that. It's the front bit you're aware of, and all these things going on together. Now, I've kind of put some of these things together into an idea I've called tidal consciousness or tidal emergence model. It's not a theory about how conscious brains work. But it's starting to put together some ideas of how these things actually hang together with all these different facts. How might that actually mean your brain works? You can read about it in the links to go below. I've got a link to a paper there. Subscribe if you want to hear more about it. Do like the video if you liked it and learned something from it. And do put the comment down below, please, for what you thought about when you saw the elephant. If you thought something really different, that'd be quite interesting to see. Maybe it related to a weird experience you had at the zoo once when you saw an elephant. I'd really like to know that. And next time a thought pops suddenly into your head, just stop for a moment and ask yourself, where did that come from? Have I been mulling over this for quite some time? And on the surface, in your awareness, you know what you're thinking. But underneath, you probably know much less about why you thought that particular thought.